In the spring of 1986, the world thought it understood nuclear power. Reactors were supposed to be safe, controlled, predictable. Accidents happened in theory, in training manuals, in Cold War nightmares, but not in real life. And yet in the forests of northern Ukraine, beside a young city called Pripyat, there stood a reactor that had been quietly collecting every mistake that politics and engineering could make. By the time someone pressed its emergency shutdown button at 1:23 in the morning, the disaster had already been built into its bones. To understand Chernobyl, you can't start with the explosion. You have to go back 20 years earlier, to a Soviet Union obsessed with the peaceful atom. In the 1960s and 70s, nuclear power wasn't just another technology. It was a promise. The atom, once tamed, would light up entire republics, melt Arctic ice under the hull of nuclear icebreakers, and prove to the world that socialism had mastered nature itself. In posters and films, smiling engineers in white coats stood under the glow of reactor domes. In speeches, party leaders talked about megawatts, the way generals talked about tanks. At the center of this atomic dream was the Kurchatov Institute in Moscow, headed for years by the famous physicist Anatoly Alexandrov. Under him, designers like Nikolai Dolezhal and dozens of lesser-known engineers worked on a family of reactors that would become the backbone of Soviet nuclear power. One branch of that family was the RBMK, a high-power channel-type reactor. It was large, flexible, and on paper economical. It could run on relatively low-enriched fuel, double as a source of weapons-grade plutonium, and be built in modules across the country. For Soviet planners, it seemed like the perfect workhorse. In the late 1960s, party and government committees chose a site near the Pripyat River, not far from Kyiv, for a new RBMK plant. The spot offered a steady water supply, good conditions for cooling, and easy connection to the regional grid. It also had something else going for it. There were few people living there. That would change. In 1970, construction began on both the plant and a brand new city to house its workers. The city was called Pripyat. On paper, it was just another planned settlement. In reality, it was one of the most desirable postings in the entire Soviet Union. Young engineers and technicians moved in with their families. They received higher salaries, priority access to consumer goods, and apartments with modern conveniences. There were schools, a stadium, a culture palace, a swimming pool, a hospital, and an amusement park with a Ferris wheel that would become infamous because it never had time to open. By 1977, Chernobyl's Unit 1, an RBMK 1000 reactor capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electric power, was online. Unit 2 followed in 1978, Unit 3 in 1981, and Unit 4 in 1983. Each new startup was reported as a triumph of Soviet science. For residents, life settled into a rhythm. Children walked to school past slogans about the peaceful atom. Parents worked shifts at the plant, proud of their role in building the future. Fishing on the warm water channels became a weekend pastime. Few of them knew exactly how the reactor that fed their city really worked. Strip away the jargon, and a nuclear reactor is a simple idea. Uranium fuel sits inside a core. Neutrons fly out of split atoms and hit other atoms, continuing the chain reaction. A moderator, like water or graphite, slows those neutrons down so they're more likely to cause more fissions. Coolant carries heat away to make steam. The steam spins turbines, and the turbines generate electricity. What matters is how the design behaves when something goes wrong. The RBMK made some unusual choices. Instead of a thick steel pressure vessel, its core was a forest of individual vertical channels. Long tubes of zirconium alloy, each holding fuel assemblies and high-pressure water flowing upward. The moderator wasn't water, it was a giant block of graphite, with the channels drilled through it. Control rods moved up and down to absorb neutrons and regulate the reaction. The whole structure sat beneath a heavy concrete and steel plate. But unlike Western reactors, There was no massive containment dome around it. On paper, the RBMK's advantages were obvious. Using graphite to slow neutrons meant the reactor could use low-enriched fuel and still maintain a chain reaction. Separating the coolant water into channels gave engineers flexibility and allowed the design to be scaled up. It was, to many Soviet scientists, a clever and economical approach, but hidden in that cleverness was a trap. In most reactors, if the coolant boils away and turns to steam, the chain reaction tends to slow down. That's a negative void coefficient. Steam bubbles, or voids, make the reactor less reactive and therefore safer. In the RBMK, the opposite could happen. Because graphite did the moderating and water absorbed some neutrons, when water turned into steam and became less dense, fewer neutrons were absorbed by the coolant. More of them stayed in the core, and for certain configurations, the chain reaction actually sped up. That's a positive void coefficient. Under the wrong conditions, more steam could mean more power instead of less. It was the engineering equivalent of a car, where pushing the brake pedal sometimes pressed the accelerator. The problems didn't stop there. The RBMK's control rods, the very tools meant to shut down the reaction, had their own quirk. The main body of each rod was made of boron carbide, which absorbs neutrons and calms the reaction. But the tips of the rods were made of graphite, attached to displacement sections that first pushed water out of the channels when the rod was inserted. That meant when you hit the emergency shutdown button, those graphite tips entered the bottom of the core first, displacing water and briefly increasing reactivity before the boron sections followed behind. In normal operation at high power, this effect didn't matter much. At low power, with a core already filled with steam voids and poisoned by xenon, it could be catastrophic. Those design features were known to a small circle of specialists. Some tests in the late 1970s and early 1980s hinted at dangerous behavior during certain transients. But in a system built on secrecy, bad news didn't travel well. Reports were classified, conclusions softened, and safety warnings buried in technical language that never reached the people who would one day be sitting in front of the control panels. Meanwhile, in Pripyat, life looked almost utopian by Soviet standards. Cafes, a cinema, youth sports clubs, the river, and green courtyards between apartment blocks. The plant's workforce was young, educated, and ambitious. They knew they were working at one of the most important power stations in the country. They also knew they were being watched. By party committees, by ministries, by the ever-present pressure of the plan. Every factory, every plant, every power station had production targets. For Chernobyl, that meant electricity. Meeting or over-fulfilling the plan brought bonuses and career advancement. Falling short brought criticism, investigations, and humiliation. Between Moscow's Kurchatov Institute and the line workers at Unit 4, there were layers of bureaucracy that didn't want to hear the word impossible. Experiments that could improve safety or performance existed on paper but often died in files because nobody wanted to slow down production. Others, like the one that would be attempted in April 1986, were delayed again and again. The test that doomed Unit 4 didn't start as a reckless idea. It was an engineering problem. If the station lost external power, the reactors had diesel generators to keep safety systems running. But those generators took time to start and reach stable speed around 40 to 50 seconds. Engineers asked a simple question. Could the inertia of the spinning turbines, as they wound down, generate enough electricity to bridge that gap? If they could, the plant would have another layer of protection. Attempts to run this test had already been made at Chernobyl and other RBMK plants. They had either failed or not been fully completed. Electrical conditions weren't right, procedures needed tweaking, and the balance between grid demands and a safe test window was hard to achieve. Still, the idea never went away. And in the spring of 1986, Chernobyl's leadership decided to try again during a scheduled maintenance shutdown of Unit 4. On April 25, 1986, the plan was simple. In the morning, operators would begin reducing power on Unit 4. At a certain level, they would disconnect the reactor from the grid, run through the rundown test on Turbo Generator 8, collect data, and then continue shutting down for maintenance. The test had been designed by specialists in Moscow. It had been approved. It was not some secret experiment invented by board operators on a night shift. In the early hours of April 25th, power was indeed reduced. But then another part of the Soviet system intervened. The dispatcher responsible for the regional electrical grid in Kyiv saw trouble. Demand for electricity was high. Taking a big reactor out of service in the middle of the day would cause shortages, so he called the plant and told them to keep Unit 4 running at partial power. The shutdown was postponed. The test was put on hold. For hours, Unit 4 ran at a reduced level. That decision, made for perfectly understandable reasons, had a hidden consequence inside the core. At lower power, the concentration of a neutron-absorbing fission product, xenon-135, builds up. It's produced when uranium splits, and for a while, it acts as a powerful brake on the reaction. This xenon poisoning is normally taken into account during power changes, but the way it interacts with RBMK dynamics at low power was not fully reflected in the standard operating instructions. By the evening, the dispatcher finally released the plant to proceed with the shutdown. It was late. The day shift had gone home. A new crew came on qualified, but younger and less experienced. They faced a difficult puzzle: lower power as planned, satisfy test conditions, and wrestle a huge reactor out of an awkward, partially poisoned state. When they dropped power further, the reactor's output fell not to the planned 700 megawatts thermal, but to around 30. That was far below the level prescribed for stable operation. To recover, operators began withdrawing control rods and disabling certain automatic protections that would otherwise shut the reactor down. In a different design, such actions would still be buffered by strong inherent safety behavior. In the RBMK, with its positive void coefficient and graphite moderator, they were stepping into a narrow path with cliffs on either side. By around 1 a.m., Unit 4 was limping along at roughly 200 megawatts thermal, about 7% of nominal power. Many of the control rods were high in the core. The allowed minimum number of fully inserted rods had effectively been violated. Water flow through the core was high, cooling channels strongly, and system configurations deviated from the original test program. In the control room sat people like Leonid Toptunov, a young senior reactor control engineer, and Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, both under the authority of Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, who had a reputation for being harsh and demanding. On the panel, alarms and signals flashed as systems registered abnormal states. Some protections were bypassed. Others were ignored, as operators struggled to keep the reactor stable enough to carry out the test and still meet expectations from above. They did not know that the combination of low power, high xenon content, partial rod withdrawal, and RBMK physics had pushed the core into a state where a small change could cause a violent reaction. At 1:23 in the morning, on April 26th, the test finally began. Steam to the turbines was cut off. The generators, now disconnected from fresh steam, began to slow, their mechanical energy feeding electricity into the plant's systems as they coasted down. Inside the core, coolant flow began to change. Steam voids formed in channels as water heated and boiled. In an ideal world, the reactor would respond smoothly. In Unit 4, something else happened. Just seconds after the test started, power fluctuations and unstable conditions alarmed Akimov. At 1 hour 23 minutes and 40 seconds, he ordered an emergency shutdown. The AZ5 button was pressed. In every training manual, that button was the last line of defense. It drove all the control rods down into the core, flooding it with neutron-absorbing material, cutting off the chain reaction. It was the brake pedal people trusted more than anything else. But the RBMK's rods did not bring only boron carbide into the core. They brought graphite tips. As the rods started their descent from the fully withdrawn position, those graphite sections pushed into the lower part of the core first, displacing water from channels. In a core already filled with pockets of steam, under-moderated in some regions and over-moderated in others, this sudden insertion of extra moderator at the bottom was like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire. Within less than a second, the power surged. Estimates suggest that it jumped to many times the reactor's nominal output. Fuel channels ruptured. Superheated water flashed into steam. The enormous pressures involved tore the internals apart. The 1,000-ton upper biological shield plate, designed to sit solidly above the core, was violently lifted and tilted. A first explosion blew apart the pressure channels and destroyed the reactor vessel region. A second explosion, likely hydrogen or steam, ripped open the reactor building and hurled graphite blocks and glowing fuel fragments onto nearby roofs and the ground around Unit 4. In the control room, instruments died, diagrams went blank. Invisible alpha and beta particles streamed into the air, along with gamma radiation and clouds of radioactive isotopes. Yet many of the people on site refused to believe what had just happened. According to their training, the reactor was too heavy, too protected, too robust to be gone. The idea that an RBMK could physically explode had been considered impossible. Outside, the night sky above the station lit up with a strange blue glow, Cherenkov radiation in the air, mixing with the orange of fires on rooftops and in the destroyed core. Bits of graphite, the very moderator that had slowed neutrons hours earlier, now burned like charcoal on the roof of the turbine hall. At 1:26, the first call went out to the fire department. Plant firefighters under the command of men like Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik and Lieutenant Viktor Kibanok arrived within minutes. They saw flames, heard the crackle of burning material, and felt the heat of the blaze. They did not see radiation. They had only their usual gear: canvas coats, helmets, rubber boots, and gas masks, which many quickly removed because of the heat and the need to communicate. They climbed onto the roofs to fight what they thought was an industrial fire. They walked directly among fragments of fuel and graphite that were emitting terrifying levels of radiation. Some picked up pieces with bare hands or kicked them aside. They didn't know that every minute they spent there was loading their bodies with doses that textbooks described in theoretical chapters, doses few doctors had ever treated. Inside the plant, operators tried to pump water into what they still assumed was a damaged but intact core. Emergency systems were activated blindly. Instruments lied or were off-scale. In the city of Pripyat, meanwhile, people woke briefly to flashes and distant sirens, wondered what was going on, and went back to sleep. By dawn, some of the first firefighters and plant workers began to vomit. Their skin reddened. Heads ached, fevers spiked. They were told they had been overheated or suffered stress. Some were taken to the local hospital. Later that day, many would be flown to specialized clinics in Moscow. Not all would return. In Moscow, information came slowly and was filtered through layers of bureaucracy. Early reports described a fire under control, a minor incident, maybe a hydrogen explosion in a turbine hall. When physicists in the Academy of Sciences tried to piece it together from the little data available, they began to suspect the truth. But in the Soviet political system of 1986, admitting a nuclear catastrophe was not something one did quickly or openly. Hundreds of kilometers away, on the morning of April 28, workers at a nuclear plant in Sweden noticed something strange. Radiation monitors at the plant's gate triggered alarms when staff arrived. At first, the Swedes suspected a leak at their own station, but checks showed that the radioactivity was on the workers' clothing, not coming from inside the plant. Detailed analysis of airborne particles suggested a mixture of isotopes that didn't match a weapons test. The only plausible source was a reactor. By tracking air masses, they concluded the cloud was drifting from the Soviet Union. That same day, Swedish authorities asked the USSR for an explanation. The story, which had already leaked into foreign media, was no longer containable by silence. At 9 p.m. on April 28, the TASS news agency finally issued a short statement. There had been an accident at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, one reactor damaged, measures were being taken, victims were being helped. No details, no numbers, no admission that the core of Unit 4 no longer existed in one piece. While the world was just learning the name Chernobyl, the people of Pripyat were still in their apartments. Radiation levels in the city rose and fell with the wind and rain. Children played outside. Workers came and went from shifts. Some noticed helicopters in the air doing something over the plant. Others noticed soldiers and unfamiliar men in protective clothing. Rumors spread that something serious had happened, but official information was almost non-existent. On April 27, buses began to arrive. Loudspeakers on trucks announced that residents were to be evacuated temporarily. They were told they would be gone for 3 days, maybe a week. They should bring documents, a little money, some food. Pets would have to stay behind. Many people locked their doors, leaving plates on tables, laundry in washing machines, books open on desks, fully expecting to come back as they had been promised. Most never did. In the midst of this chaos, a government commission arrived at Chernobyl. Among its members was Valery Legasov, a distinguished chemist and first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute. He was not a reactor engineer by training, but he understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant when a core was exposed to the open air and graphite was burning. On the ground, he saw dosimeters off scale, firefighters in makeshift protection, and a partially destroyed plant still housing 3 operating reactors. Legasov became one of the first senior scientists to insist that the situation was not just a local industrial accident. It was a disaster with continental implications. He argued for the immediate evacuation of Pripyat and surrounding villages, the rapid deployment of military resources, and the development of a plan to contain the wrecked core. In meetings with ministers and generals, he pushed against the instinctive Soviet reflex to downplay, delay, or deny. One of the first urgent tasks was simple in concept and brutal in execution: extinguish the fire and stop the release of radioactive material. To do that, helicopters began flying over the glowing crater of Unit 4, dropping bags of sand, clay, dolomite, lead, and compounds containing boron to absorb neutrons. Crews flew again and again, approaching low over the crater where radiation levels were extreme. They could hear crackling interference in their headsets as particles slammed into electronics. Flight engineers initially threw bags by hand, then improved the process with slings and parachute rigs. By early May, they had carried out thousands of sorties, dumping nearly 5,000 tons of material into the shattered core. Even as the top of the reactor was being smothered from the air, another danger lurked beneath it. Molten fuel and structural materials corium was slowly eating through the concrete layers under the reactor. Under them lay rooms and pools containing large volumes of water. If that mass had dropped into the water, it could have caused a violent steam explosion, throwing more contaminated material into the air and potentially rendering much of Europe uninhabitable. Calculations at the time painted nightmare scenarios. To prevent that, engineers had to drain the water. But the valves controlling the drainage were deep in flooded, dark corridors close to the destroyed core. The area was dangerous and partially collapsed. Special pumps couldn't be quickly rigged. In the end, it came down to a handful of volunteers. Among them were engineer Alexei Ananenko, engineer Valery Bespalov, and shift supervisor Boris Baranov. Wearing wetsuits and carrying flashlights and dosimeters, they waded through radioactive water, feeling their way along pipes and walls in near-total darkness, looking for the right valves. The story has often been told as a suicide mission. In reality, they survived, but the risk they took was real, and it was their actions that allowed the water to be drained and the worst-case scenario to be avoided. At the same time, another kind of battle was underway in Moscow and abroad. The international community demanded an explanation. In August 1986, the International Atomic Energy Agency convened a special meeting in Vienna. Many expected a high-ranking Soviet political figure to appear. Instead, it was Legasov who stood at the podium. For hours, he delivered a detailed technical and chronological account of the accident, what was known, what was suspected, where human error had occurred, and where the RBMK's design had failed. He showed slides, diagrams, charts. Delegates who had expected denial or propaganda were surprised by the depth and relative openness of his report. The price for that frankness would come later. Within the Soviet system, Legasov's insistence on acknowledging design flaws and systemic problems was not welcome. His proposals for sweeping safety reforms met resistance. He was nominated for high honors and then quietly passed over. He faced criticism, professional isolation, and the slow psychological erosion that comes when a system tells you that telling the truth was the real crime. On the second anniversary of the accident, in April 1988, after years of health problems from radiation exposure and constant pressure, Legasov ended his life in his Moscow apartment, leaving behind tapes in which he spoke bluntly about what had gone wrong not only at Chernobyl, but in the Soviet nuclear industry as a whole. While all this unfolded, the physical cleanup of the site moved into a new phase. The sarcophagus, officially the object's shelter, was designed and built at remarkable speed over the remainder of 1986. It was a massive concrete and steel structure intended to enclose the remains of Unit 4 and limit further releases of radioactive dust and gases. It was never meant to last forever. It was a desperate response to a desperate situation. Around the plant, a new geography emerged. A 10-kilometer exclusion zone around Chernobyl grew into a 30-kilometer zone, encompassing Pripyat and dozens of villages. Hundreds of thousands of people were resettled. Soldiers and civilians, called liquidators, streamed into the area over the next several years. Firefighters, construction workers, drivers, medical staff, scientists, miners, and regular infantry units. Estimates of their numbers run into the hundreds of thousands. Some of the most dangerous work took place on the roofs of the remaining buildings around Unit 4, particularly the roof of Unit 3 and parts of the turbine hall. These surfaces were littered with highly radioactive chunks of graphite and fuel. Engineers tried to use remotely controlled robots from the Soviet Union, Germany, and other countries to clear them. But the radiation was so intense that many of the robots' electronics failed almost immediately. Reluctantly, commanders turned to bio-robots soldiers in improvised lead aprons and simple respirators sent onto the roofs for shifts measured in tens of seconds. Men would run out, scoop up a piece of graphite with a shovel or their gloved hands, throw it into a designated pit, and run back. Each trip added to their dose. Some units were told they were performing routine work. Others were more aware of the risks. They were promised benefits, medals, early retirement. Some received them. Others did not. Many struggled with health issues in the years that followed, caught in the gray zone where radiation doses were high enough to harm but low enough to be disputed. Officially, 30 people died in the first acute phase of the accident, plant workers and firefighters who received massive doses in the first hours and days. The long-term death toll is far more controversial. Different studies and organizations have produced estimates ranging from thousands to tens of thousands of additional cancers over decades across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and beyond. Arguments over methodology, statistics, and politics still shape how those numbers are presented. What is not in doubt is that Chernobyl left a scar in the bodies and lives of countless individuals whose names never make it into documentaries. As the 1980s turned into the 1990s, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The Chernobyl plant, now in independent Ukraine, kept operating its 3 undamaged reactors. Electricity was desperately needed. Shutting down the entire station immediately was economically and politically difficult. Under international pressure and with financial assistance, Unit 2 was shut down after a fire in 1991 Unit 1 inch 1996, and Unit 3 the last operating reactor at the end of 2000. With that, power production at Chernobyl finally stopped. Elsewhere, other RBMK reactors continued operating in Russia and Lithuania, but they did not keep their original configuration. Under international scrutiny, engineers undertook extensive modifications, adding more control rods, redesigning rods to eliminate the dangerous graphite tips, changing fuel enrichment patterns, and reducing the positive void coefficient to much safer levels. Additional safety systems and procedures were put in place. The design that had exploded on that April night would never exist in that exact form again. Meanwhile, the first Chernobyl sarcophagus aged. It had been built quickly, under high radiation and with limited access to damaged structures. It leaked, its roof sagged. The risk grew that parts could collapse, sending new plumes of radioactive dust into the environment. Once again, engineers and politicians faced a problem no one had ever solved before: how to safely enclose and eventually dismantle a destroyed reactor core. The answer took the form of the new safe confinement, a colossal arch structure large enough to span the entire sarcophagus. Designed and financed by an international consortium, the arch was built on rails next to the reactor and then slid into place, enclosing Unit 4 inches, a sealed, controlled environment. Completed and commissioned in the late 2010s, it was designed to last at least a century. Inside, cranes and robotic systems would one day begin the delicate work of cutting apart the old shelter and handling the radioactive debris beneath. By then, the word Chernobyl meant more than a place. It had become shorthand for catastrophe, secrecy, technological hubris, and the price of lies. It also became, ironically, a destination. With carefully controlled routes and strict rules, guided tours began to take visitors into the exclusion zone. They walked through empty apartment blocks in Pripyat, saw trees growing through concrete, amusement park rides rusted in place, wild animals reclaiming fields and streets. The zone turned into a strange museum of late Soviet life, frozen in 1986, and a living experiment in how ecosystems respond when humans leave and radiation remains. For Ukraine, Chernobyl was a burden and a symbol. The plant housing and liquidator pensions, the exclusion zone maintenance, the scientific monitoring, all of it required money and attention long after the reactor had stopped producing electricity. Yet the country also inherited the responsibility for a dangerous legacy created in a different political era. In 2022, that responsibility collided with war. When Russian forces invaded Ukraine in February, one of their axes of advance ran through the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Armored columns rolled down roads built for plant logistics. Trenches were dug in contaminated soil. Reports emerged of Russian troops looting facilities, disturbing monitoring systems, and camping in some of the most radioactive parts of the forest. For several weeks, the world watched anxiously as fighting took place around a site that had already shown what a nuclear disaster could look like. By the end of March, Russian forces withdrew from the area, but not without leaving damage. Laboratories were robbed, equipment destroyed, and decommissioning work set back. Even after Russian troops left, the danger didn't disappear. In early 2025, Ukrainian officials reported that a Russian drone strike had hit the protective structures around the destroyed Unit 4. A fire broke out on parts of the new safe confinement's outer shell. Emergency crews managed to extinguish it, and radiation monitors did not register a major release. But the image of flames licking the covering of a reactor that had already poisoned half a continent triggered a wave of outrage. Western governments pledged millions of euros for emergency repairs and reinforcement. International agencies rushed to assess the damage and figure out how to protect the structure in a war zone. It was a bitter reminder that Chernobyl is not just history. The destroyed reactor, now entombed under layers of concrete and steel and high-tech shielding, still contains dangerous materials. It still demands monitoring, maintenance, and protection. And even decades later, Human decisions about war, about money, about politics can still bring it back into the headlines. What did Chernobyl change? Almost everything. In Europe, it triggered moratoria on new nuclear construction, referendums, and a wave of anti-nuclear activism that reshaped energy policy for decades. Internationally, it led to new safety conventions, peer reviews, and more transparency between countries' nuclear regulators. The myth of the infallible reactor died in that bright blue glow above Unit 4. It also showed, in the starkest possible way, how engineering decisions made years earlier can intersect with culture and politics to produce catastrophe. The RBMK's positive void coefficient, its graphite-tipped rods, its lack of robust containment. These were specific technical choices, catalogued now in reports and textbooks. But they only became deadly because they were coupled with a system where bad news was hidden, where manuals omitted uncomfortable truths, where operators weren't told how dangerous low-power operation could be, and where the pressure to meet the plan overrode the instinct to stop and say no. At the same time, Chernobyl revealed something else: the sheer capacity for courage and sacrifice in ordinary people. Firefighters who went into a burning radioactive nightmare without understanding what it would do to their bodies. Helicopter crews who flew over a smoking crater again and again. Engineers who stepped into flooded basements to turn valves. Soldiers who carried graphite off a roof with a shovel and 30 seconds of exposure. Scientists like Legasov, who chose to tell uncomfortable truths and paid for it with their careers and their lives. Today, if you stand on a safe viewing platform near the new safe confinement and look at the silver arch covering the remains of Unit 4, you're looking at more than steel and concrete. You're looking at a monument to everything that went wrong. The design flaws left uncorrected, the warnings ignored, the delays in evacuation, the secrecy that turned an accident into a global disaster. But you are also looking at a monument to everything that went right when it mattered, the rushed engineering that contained the core, the people who stayed at their posts, and the world that eventually came together, however imperfectly, to build something safer over the ruins. The Chernobyl reactor exploded nearly 4 decades ago, but its story isn't finished. It lives on in every nuclear safety regulation, in every emergency exercise at every plant in the world, in every political debate about energy, and in a war where someone still thinks it's acceptable to fire weapons at a site that should have been left in peace. As long as reactors exist, and as long as secrecy, arrogance, and war exist, Chernobyl will be there, not just as a cautionary tale from the past, but as a warning written in concrete, steel, and graphite about what the cost of lies really is.